Flicking the bean, jerking the gherkin, polishing the pearl. Humans have been engaging in me time since time immemorial. So why is this topic still so laden with shame? Until fairly recently, it seems like the topic of self-gratification just wasn't on the table at all. And many believe it only really began with the sex-positive revolution in the 60s and 70s. History tells us a very different story. It would not be an exaggeration to say that for the majority of human history, self-pleasure was considered no more scandalous than eating or defecating. It was considered a normal bodily function and a normal part about what it means to be human. So how did we get here? Where many of us are still trying to unlearn so much of the shame surrounding masturbation, and it still feels like a radical thing to talk about. Hi, I'm Dr. Esme Louise James, and I'm a sex historian, and today we are talking all about self-pleasure. So strap in, or strap on, and let's do some kinky history. The term masturbation only appears in our vocabulary around the 18th century, and it was a result of our sudden desire to criminalize the act. That doesn't mean that we weren't doing it before this, quite the opposite actually. It was considered so unremarkable that we didn't feel the need to pathologize it. Until this time, we were doing it like the monkeys, who, by the way, along with other animal species, have been found to enact the words of Divinal's hit single. The term was likely coined in 1712 by John Martin, an English surgeon who is believed to have published the widely influential publication Onania, or the Heinous Sin of Self-Pollution. Now, this tract sought to expose the frightful consequences faced by both sexes for engaging in any such act, and these ranged from physical ailments to spiritual damnation. This publication, along with a plethora of similar publications that it inspired, marked an important moment in the early modern period. It was during this time that our thinking relationship to a range of bodily functions, including sex, self-pleasure, and even eating, changed. Masturbation had not needed a name prior to this moment because it was simply something that happened. The very act of naming masturbation was an attempt to police, not to understand this behavior. Wanking was no longer something you could simply enjoy in your bedchambers. Now it was a diagnosis laden with shame. It's no coincidence then that the words and phrases that we use to describe masturbation are so odd and tonally undecided. Language can be incredibly medical and detached. Words like autoeroticism or touching yourself. They can be laden with violence and shame like self-abuse and self-pollution, or they can be uncomfortably playful like hand party or playing with yourself. I really love this quote from Dr. Kate Lister on the topic. She says, "As sex became repressed, words linking to the body became taboo. After all, how can you enjoy sexuality of our bodies shame-free when the very words we use to talk about them or write about them are considered obscene?" Love that quote. But why do we masturbate? Is it an adequate substitute for partner sex? The stats behind it do tell a very different story. Far from the prevailing stigma as an activity for the lonely, the more sexual partners that you have, the more likely you are to enjoy a little bit of a five-finger shuffle. Let's just look at one finding. Men who had had no sexual partners in the last year were 69% likely to have masturbated, whereas men who'd only had 2 or more partners were 91% likely to have enjoyed this little pastime. That's a pretty sizable increase. Rather than an activity to simply fill the void, masturbation goes a long way in helping to increase our libido. Quite ironically, one of the signs of a healthy, burgeoning relationship is often thought to be an increase in acts of self-pleasure, as both parties experience a peak in their hormonal fires. This is not too dissimilar to the social role that masturbation was believed to have played back in ancient Greece, where it was considered a healthy substitute for other sexual pleasures. Engagement in self-enjoyment was thought to protect against more destructive forces of sexual frustration and therefore curb rates of adultery, which was considered extremely socially harmful. Plenty of depictions of humans absolutely feeling themselves exist through the ancient world. In spite of recent debates regarding the very existence of women's sexual pleasure, one of the oldest depictions of masturbation is a clay figurine of a woman getting handsy with herself. Far more than just an activity to make you feel fierce and fine, masturbation served a social purpose in many cultures. The ancient Sumerians believed that it could enhance one's sexual potency. The act could be carried out either alone or with one's chosen partner present, the OG form of mutual masturbation. In ancient Egypt, wanking was thought to be responsible for perhaps the greatest social benefit, bringing the entire world into existence. Their mythology told that the god Atum created the universe by nulling the void in its most literal sense. The flow of the Nile River was even considered to be the result of the frequency of the god's ejaculations up in the heavens. Nice. It's quite hard for us to imagine now, but there was a time when wrestling with your one-eyed wonder weasel was most likely considered just as scandalous as eating in public. The infamous philosopher Diogenes provides a fantastic example of this. The founder of Stoicism was well renowned for his many public displays. These include, but are far from limited to, bathing, as well as living in a bathtub out in public, defecating in public, and wanking for all to see. In defense of his actions, Diogenes is known to have stated, "If only it was so easy to banish hunger by rubbing one's belly." Interestingly, eating out in the public spaces is listed among his public transgressions, suggesting that eating in front of people was likely considered as taboo as all of the rest of his transgressions. If we want to look at the connection of self-pleasure to food, then we really need to look no further than everyone's favorite cerealist, Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. It is an endlessly fun fact for parties that Kellogg's cornflakes, a common product in pantries across the globe, was invented to stop people from masturbating. Kellogg was a proponent in the initial crusade against masturbation, claiming, quite hilariously I think, such a victim literally dies by his own hand. Engagement in such immoral acts of self-gratification would lead the sinful gratifier to develop, well, pretty much any ailment that you could possibly think of. Vision loss, cancer of the nocturnal urinary disease, sanity, etc., etc., etc. In 1894, Kellogg was to release a widely accessible cure for this devilish epidemic, his cornflake cereal. Kellogg, like many others of the time, believed that flavorful food was responsible for increasing one's sexual libido. Alternatively, bland food would help one stay away and stay grounded from these passions. In comparison to the product today, Kellogg's original recipe was absent of the one thing that makes the cereal bearable: sugar. But this wasn't his only food-based plan to curb sexual desire. Around this same time, Kellogg experimented with a contraption which ran water through the bowel before following it with yogurt delivered to both the mouth and the anus. This being the case, I think we should be somewhat grateful for the plain old cornflakes that were the ones to actually catch on. Let's remember that these views were happily published in magazines and on cereal boxes little over 100 years ago, and as the continued existence of the Kellogg's brand attests, to some acclaim. Indeed, many of these anti-masturbatory attitudes have continued to hold sway over many of our lives. David Spiegelhalter has gone as far as to claim that the publication of Onania in 1712 heralded a crushing attitude to masturbation that would last 250 years. In his fantastic overview of historical statistics regarding the practice, he points out that as late as the 1940s, the United Naval Academy of Anapolosis had rules which stated candidates shall be rejected by the examining surgeon for evidence of masturbation. Fears of resulting physical and spiritual ailments have continued to remain alive and well. Catherine Davis's survey of women in 1929 proved that a considerable portion still considered masturbation to be morally degrading, and Masters and Johnson's study in the early 1960s showed many men still feared mental illness and a case of the nerves as a result of increasingly shaking hands with their milkman. We of course do have to take a moment to talk about Masters and Johnson here. The rather infamous work of William H. Masters and Virginia E. Johnson was an important turning point in the history of sexuality. They performed many controversial trials in the second half of the 20th century in the United States, and it was a little bit more than a paper survey. Among other things, these researchers watched and recorded participants while they were in the acts of making love. Initially, their experiments were limited to paid sex workers, who, to the advantage of the research, were knowledgeable about sex, often their bodies, and willing to cooperate with their rather peculiar requests. But later, the study expanded to 382 women and 312 men, albeit mostly white, educated and married, but this allowed the researchers to conclude that they'd observed 10,000 complete cycles of the sexual response. Now, this scenario was far from satin sheets and candlelight for the near 1,000 participants who were connected to instruments in the laboratory which would measure things like their heart rate, breathing, or even changes in their lubrication. Participants had the option to wear a brown paper bag on their head to preserve their identity, while the researchers recorded and observed their activities. Inspired by the great Cyclops of ancient Greek mythology, Masters and Johnson created Ulysses, a whopping machine of a dildo with a camera placed inside to attain some intervaginal photography. A bit different from your classic lewd picture, but I'll allow it. The primary achievement of this device was to demonstrate how vaginal lubrication worked, dispelling previous beliefs that it originated from the cervix, and to debunk the notion, popularized by Freud, you can't ever seem to avoid him, that vaginal stimulation proved a superior orgasm to the clitoral stimulation. Ulysses proved once and for all that the orgasmic response was the same, whether or not a woman decided to insert something inside of her, an argument that had been used to demonstrate the need for the penis up until now. Masters and Johnson became notorious because they became desensitized to their work. Admittedly, I've had this same issue, forgetting after hours of reading about prehistoric dildos that not everyone considers this normal conversation around the dinner table. But I haven't gone as far as to display an intervaginal photo shoot at an academic seminar. Yes, a video of a woman masturbating with Ulysses was played back to an audience of their academic peers, a professional faux pas which saw the duo face increased scrutiny from these peers. Yet, no slap on the wrist could smother their passion for the cause. When Masters and Johnson didn't have the participants to continue completing their trials, they nobly took upon the burdens themselves, engaging in erotic acts by themselves and with one another so they could continue their studies, all for the sake of science and not their marital partners. But despite their questionable research practices, which absolutely would not make it past the ethics committee today, Masters and Johnson had a profound impact on sexual studies as we know them. The publication of their research, Human Sexual Response, in 1966 made a tremendous impact upon the legitimization of sexuality as a field of academic study, triggering a variety of further research. They rejected the idea of sex exceptionalism, that sex is an inherently different topic from other human activities. Indeed, by making it the focus of veritable scientific observation, Masters and Johnson took sex and sexuality out of the forbidden section of the academic library and demonstrated that this aspect of human life is part of our holistic well-being. Though Ulysses has rightfully gone to an early retirement, we remain indebted to their infamous contributions. It's little wonder then that this ethos of shame still exists around acts of self-pleasure today. Even the most sex-positive members of our society have very likely had to endure a process of unlearning cultural stigmas which still persist around this act. It's shameful, it's dirty, it's something that should never be spoken of in polite conversation. It also seems our constantly changing relationships to bodily functions is far from limited to the philosophy of choking the chicken. We only have to look at rules set by different cultures around the world to see the inconsistencies in how we relate to our bodies. To eat with your mouth open or closed, to use utensils or to use your hands, to hold in your burps or to slurp loudly during your meal. These differences we find across the globe should remind us that our thinking surrounding our bodies has everything to do with our social world. And in particular, in the Western world, that influence can be summarized by one word: shame. The result is far more than just a yucky feeling in your stomach after climaxing alone. How we talk and how we think about self-pleasure equally affects how we talk and think about sex. And we don't need to delve too deeply into our history books to see the dangers of repressing that conversation. Pleasure is powerful, and it's a driving force for so many things we do in life. Long gone are the days of Kellogg declaring war on pleasurable food and activities. Pleasure is something that we seek out every single day without even realizing it. Yet, of all of the ways that we can experience pleasure, sexual pleasure is amongst the last to be normalized. I would like to think that we are heading towards a time when, as it was with Diogenes, masturbation is on par with eating and shitting, where, as with these other bodily functions, we can have open and healthy conversations about what is safe and what is normal. Masturbation isn't going anywhere. Even after an entire war was waged against it, it was still very much part of our lives today. And so now we have an opportunity to view masturbation once again as a normal bodily experience, with the added benefit of discussing why it should not take place in public forums. Nudge nudge, wink wink, Diogenes. We've seen our views change considerably throughout the course of our history, and our unique position at this moment allows us to recognize that self-pleasure is a normal part of being human, whilst also looking to how technology can aid us in having safer and even more pleasurable experiences when it comes to discussions of sex toys as sexual aids, and also discussions with one another about different and more ethical ways we can relate to ourselves, one another, and the world at large. And if you enjoyed this lesson today, please keep joining me here for plenty more kinky history. My book is of course available if you want to do more of a deep dive, and I have plenty of upcoming events and I would love to see you there.